Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. We are very excited to have Pulitzer Center grantee and professional journalist Lisa Armstrong with us today to tell us about her reporting on trauma and juvenile detention facilities. She's also written about the spread of COVID-19 in New York State prisons and produced a documentary for CBS News about the role that mental health care provided by for-profit companies has played in an increase in suicides in state prisons, and we'll be watching that work today. Armstrong has also directed a documentary about a young man who was incarcerated in an adult prison when he was 16, and that film, called Little Boy Lost, was featured in the Social Impact track at South by Southwest 2018. Armstrong was a 2021 Knight Wallace Reporting Fellow, 2019 United States Artist Fellow in Writing, and a 2018 Justice Reporting Fellow for the John J. Langeloth Foundation Fellowship on Reinventing Solitary Confinement. If that weren't enough, Lisa is also a professor at the University of California, Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. So please welcome journalist and Professor Lisa Armstrong.
Thank you very much. So I am going to tell you the stories of three young people, and I'm sorry for standing back here, but I have to work this thing. So three young people who served time in prisons. The first is Damien, who at the age of 16 was incarcerated in an adult facility in Florida. The second is Miriam, who was incarcerated at 14 in Arizona. And then the third is Joshua, who was locked up first when he was 11 years old. And he is the young man who, that's the Pulitzer Center funding that I've received most recently was to do some reporting that looked at the Texas Juvenile Justice Department, specifically looking at what happened to Joshua. But I'm choosing to start with Damien, and this is Damien up on the stage here, for a couple of reasons. One, as I shared in the class before, and as you might imagine, in reporting on incarceration, I see a fair amount of trauma. I've been covering juvenile incarceration for about 10 years. And so actually before I start, I just want to say that some of what I'm going to talk about deals with self-harm and suicide. And so if anybody needs to step out or do whatever you need to do to take care of yourselves, please feel free to. But I want to start with Damien because I want to start with joy. And one of the things is that when I'm reporting, I'm trying to show who people are beyond the crime that they have been convicted of or that they have committed. Because that sort of is where we get stuck. If you look at people who are incarcerated, often the focus is on what they did to get into prison, and we don't look at them as being whole people. And I think if you think about this for yourselves, if you think about the worst thing that you've ever done, imagine just everywhere that you go through life as that being the thing that defined you. I'm sure that people wouldn't necessarily want that. So what I try to do in my reporting, again, is to get to know who people are, who they were as young people, what led them to whatever it is that landed them in prison, and then just what has happened to them since. What have they experienced in the correctional facilities? So this is Damien, and this is at the premiere of the film that I directed that was about his incarceration. He grew up in Florida, and his mother had him when she was 17 years old. And at around 11, his father was not so much in the picture. And around 11, he figured that he was sort of the man of the household. His mother had at that time had another child, and so he felt like he needed to take care of his family. And so he started doing things like stealing. He was dealing drugs, and he was arrested, and he was sent to an adult facility. Now, while he was there, he spent a fair amount of time isolated, and one of the things that he shared with me was that when he was isolated, he wrote music. He wrote music and he wrote a screenplay. The screenplay was about a penguin that lived in Miami but had all these adventures. The penguin met Obama, the penguin traveled all over the place. But he wrote these things to keep his mind occupied. And As you can see, the way this documentary was unique in that it was done with the Young Arts Foundation. The Young Arts Foundation is based in Miami, and they work with young artists. And so the person who shot the footage for the film was a young arts, someone from Young Arts, who was actually like 19 years old. The musicians you see in the background, they were I think like 19, 20 years old. And so the idea was to create a documentary that would be paired with spoken word poetry. So the documentary was narrated with spoken word poetry, and it was paired with live music. And so when I shared this concept, Damien said that his dream had been to perform. I shared with Daniel, who was the person with the mic there, who was my co-director, and he composed the music. And that I wanted to give Damien the chance to perform. And Daniel said, well, it's one thing for people to perform in their bedrooms or wherever, and another thing to get on stage and see 400 people in front of you, because you might freeze. But he eventually relented. And so I'm going to show you first the end of the documentary. And this is shot with my phone, so it's not the best, but just to give you a sense of what it was.
It's been out for 2 years. It's still hard for him to talk, or to rehabilitate, or to forget all the horrible things that happened to him as a child in an adult prison, to release the muscle memory of the prison system. See, physically, he is home, but mentally he is still in a 6 by 8 foot shell shackled, waiting on 4 a.m. head count from guards. Mentally, he's still in jumpsuits, waiting for weekend visits, following scheduled lunch times. It is still hard for him to realize that he is free.
I think the first 2 weeks were the hardest, because he would wake up in the middle of the night and he would come and sit on the chair right here in the kitchen and just be alone. And I was so helpless because I don't know what was going through his head. I don't know how could I help him. I guess he was used to being in there, people telling him what to do. I didn't know how to help him. He would just sit there with the lights off. I don't know what he was thinking. He wouldn't tell me. He didn't say nothing. He would just tell me, I'm okay, Mom. I'm okay. But I don't think he was okay. Gets to a point, I guess, to get me off his back, he'd tell me certain things. Other than that, I just hear it through his music. When he starts, he usually goes to the balcony and he just starts writing and writing.
I don't talk. I don't really talk much. I tell the majority of my songs, they'll be like about incarceration or about certain struggles in the streets or anything, and where I'm trying to go. Well, I would want people to understand that. Do what you set your mind to. Like, it's gonna be a lot of the people, they're gonna be on some, you can't do this, can't do that, and they're gonna even give you a whole resume why you can't do it. But at the end of the day, just because it ain't work for them, that doesn't involve you. I would like to be seen as a humble warrior. There's scars around me. My mind is unbuilt. I would like to be seen as, like somebody that is better than this, like going for what they believe in.
And Damien performing.
Welcome to the beach, should I write to it? No time for procrastinating next, I just do it. I'm locked up, pregnant, so she going through it. See, I'm the type that got it, point, always gotta prove it. Easy, I'm ruthless, my swag always stupid. I'm in the interrogation room, my mama let me do this. What the fuck I'm supposed to do? I told her I ain't do shit. Handcuffed, now I'm on my way to the jail pit. Now I'm in a cell, bitch, over for some nail, bitch. Years later, shit me up to prison for the counter. Did a bit, I'm in the crib, house arrest, I'm pulling it. Talking to my little brother, he ain't even listen. I told him every nigga you clap up, don't be go to. Let him in your crib, now they go to getting comfortable. Telling other people what you gotta be your crib. He say, bro, you been locked up, so you don't know shit. When he better realize I was AIDS with the same mind. Just a little better, smoking weeds, open eyes. Only thing about it, one of the knives was the mines. Got it from my uncle crib, it was laying on the fridge. Got told myself I bring it back this morning, shackled in the jack, caught it in the bitch. What the fuck I'm at? They said they come on my boys, you about to have a heart attack. Thinking about my uncle, trust me.
And so, that was Damien's first time performing in front of people, which still amazes me. I've seen this, I don't know how many times at this point. And the fact that there was seemingly absolutely no fear whatsoever. And so Damien actually went on to perform in other places. We went to South by Southwest, where we showed part of the film and talked about the concept of pairing the live music with the documentary and the spoken word poetry and Damien performing. And it was interesting, I was actually thinking about this the other day because South by Southwest just was actually last week in Austin, Texas. And so I had to get permission for Damien to travel. And this is just to tell you a little bit about how the system works even when you have been released from prison. So he's on parole and he had a parole officer. And so way before, like months and months before, I said, I want to get permission for him to leave the state to go to Texas for this festival. And the parole officer he had at the time was like, yes, but come back to me closer to the date. And then I checked in, like, say, a month before, and then the parole officer was like, yeah, okay, but check it would be closer to the date. And then the week before, I checked in again, Damien had a new parole officer, and that parole officer was like, no, why? And so I guess there are a couple of lessons in this. I contacted I called the judge's office, and the person who answered, as it turned out, was from Trinidad. And so when she answered the phone, she initially did not seem very happy to be talking to me without me asking if I need this emergency thing from the judge. My family's also from Trinidad, and so I heard her accent, and I said, oh, where in Trinidad are you from? And we had this long conversation. She's like, okay, I got you. And so she went and she got this emergency thing for Damien to travel. And then because this all didn't work out, Damien's mother was supposed to be coming with him. He was 19 at the time. And she couldn't take off of work because he hadn't told her and it was too short notice. And so I had to make sure, so there's stipulations, if he leaves the state, if he does anything, he could, anything just sort of remotely problematic, it didn't need to be something that's illegal, there's a chance he could end up incarcerated again. So I was Damien's mother for the weekend, and I told him, I was like, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. I gave him a whole list of things, like, you basically can't do anything. At the end of it, he's like, damn, can I even talk to girls? I was like, no. But so he went, he performed, and this is actually one of, I think one of the most meaningful projects that I've worked on for a couple of reasons. So I am primarily a writer, like that's why I became a journalist. And I don't get to see how people respond to the work that I do, other than if they write me, and normally if they decide to write me, either they're writing me to say, this is horrible, I was moved by this and I want to do something to help. But a lot of times, particularly with incarceration, I get, even when it's kids, like, oh, sort of if you can't do the time, don't do the crime, sort of things. And this was the first time that I saw an audience react to the work that I'd done. I mean, people were in tears, people had this very emotional response, not just to seeing the film, but also to getting to interact with Damien afterwards. And it's been an interesting thing because a lot of the work that I've done has gone sort of beyond what would be considered traditional journalism. I worked on another project that premiered at Carnegie Hall in 2019, and it was, again, working with Daniel, so it was music, dance, and spoken word poetry. And my part of this was, there were interviews with a young man who's serving a life without parole sentence for a crime committed when he was 16. And so I broke this up into, I made like sort of 3 audio segments. One from sort of our early conversations where he's talking about his childhood, the second one talking about his time in prison, and then the last one sort of talking about where he was at the time in terms of, does he have hope? What does he think about his future given that he, as of right now, is in prison for life? And it was really interesting to me because, again, I'm watching an audience react to interviews that I'd never intended for anybody really to hear. Like the conversations that we're having were not things that I recorded. I wasn't planning on doing a podcast or an audio story or anything. And there's a moment in the piece where there's someone that's dancing to this interview, and like they're using this interview as music. And you know, I think of, one of the things that I tell my students is to think of this work. I think journalism has traditionally been one thing, but I think journalism is something that is supposed to reach people in a way that they want to be reached or can be reached. And so again, like doing work like this that's more creative is something that I found really meaningful. So I want to talk a little bit about just juvenile incarceration, and this is something that someone I think in the last class asked me about these harsh sentencing and how it is that there are people who are being locked up in adult prisons as juveniles and spending, you know, decades in prison. So in 1995, there's a professor at Princeton who coined this term super predator. It was for a conservative magazine. And as you can see, he warned by the year 2000, an additional almost 30,000 young murderers, rapists, and muggers would be roaming America's streets, sowing mayhem. They placed zero value on the lives of their victims, whom they reflectively dehumanized as just so much worthless white trash, he wrote. So this was, of course, being used to describe young black and brown people. Aside from it being sort of this very racist trope, it was something that was not true. Even at the time that this was written, the statistics for juvenile arrests for these serious crimes was actually going down. And this was basically disproven. But what it meant was that, you know, judges, elected officials, like these people are people who are elected, and so they have to sort of cater to their constituents. And so if you are afraid that some young black or brown man is going to come and attack you, you want them locked up because you want to be safe. And I think the United States has, I guess perpetuated the myth that the way to deal with this is to lock people away, which is how we end up with these very long sentences. And so the first piece that I wrote was about juvenile life without parole, and it was about a 16 and 17-year-old who were convicted of a carjacking and murder and were serving life without parole sentences. They are still in prison in Michigan. I shared in the other class that they actually have a chance of being resentenced. Essentially, when I wrote this article, in 2012, the Supreme Court passed a ruling saying that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles basically is considered cruel and unusual punishment, and it's something that should be used very sparingly. And then in 2016, there was another Supreme Court ruling that made the 2012 ruling retroactive. So what that meant was that anybody who was convicted of mandatory life without parole before 2016 was eligible for resentencing. Now, what was supposed to happen based on the 2012 ruling was that if a judge was going to sentence a minor to life without parole, they had to look at mitigating factors. So they had to look at the child's age, they had to look at their home environment, their mental health, all of these things. And the idea was that if you were found to have experienced severe trauma as a child, or just come from a home where you weren't cared for, where you figured that the only way that you could have family was to find people on the streets, that the judge should then say, okay, we shouldn't sentence these people to life without parole. What I found in this story and why I centered on Michigan was that there were judges in Michigan who were using the mitigating factors against people. So in the case of Robert and Ehab, the two young men, the judge in their case did look at some of the mitigating factors, but concluded that they were so traumatized and they'd had such horrible childhoods that they were broken in a way that they could basically never be rehabilitated, and so they needed to be locked away for life. So essentially what this story was about was the fact that judges were using the Supreme Court ruling in the opposite way than it was intended. I'm going to pause this for a second. So I explained to the class before that one of the things that I tend to do is I'm reporting on one thing and then I will find another subject that I want to follow. And so Ehab, told me that he'd spent a considerable amount of time in isolation. And isolation is something that is used a lot in prisons, either because it's for behavioral reasons, so you do something and then you are locked away because it's a form of punishment, but it's also used as a way to, I don't want to say treat, I guess deal with people who have severe mental illnesses or who have suicidal tendencies or who have harmed themselves. And so as I was doing research on juvenile solitary confinement, one of the things that I found was a newspaper article in a small local paper in Arizona about this young woman, Mariam Abdullah. And Mariam was incarcerated when she was 14. And the piece that I read was about the fact that she had died by suicide at 18 in an Arizona prison. There was not much information about her. All that was attached to it was, there was a letter that had been written by a lawyer on her behalf, basically saying, we went to this prison, this young woman has been isolated for significant periods of time, we want something to happen. And that was sort of it. And I spent 3 years trying to figure out what had happened to Mariam. I've been asked a few times, why, what it was about Mariam, and I don't know that I really have an answer about sort of why it was that I felt this need to understand what had happened to her. The reporting that I did started me contacting the lawyer, Corinne Kendrick, and just asking her for any additional information. She did not know Mariam's family. She didn't know anything about Mariam personally. But I told her I was going to file a public records request with the Arizona Department of Corrections just to get data and to find out what had happened to Mariam. And one of the things that Corinne told me, and this is actually sort of, all of this hinges on the fact that I asked for this, she told me that I should ask for use of force videos as part of my request, which I did. And so basically use of force videos are any time that someone is being taken by force from one place to another, or if there's any form of force that's being used against someone who's incarcerated. So I filed a public records request, and it took about 9 months before the Arizona Department of Corrections actually gave me the records that I requested. And in the end, it was something where I'd spoken with a lawyer who was helping me to get these records because they clearly did not want to give me the things that I'd asked for. And as it turned out, I was the only person that actually got these records because Corinne had requested them, the ACLU had requested them. So there are other lawyers who had requested these records. I have no idea why I eventually was sent them. There's a part of me that thinks maybe somebody, whoever works in giving out records, wanted this stuff to be seen. But I got a disk that had about 200 files that were not labeled. I could tell sort of what the file format was, but they weren't labeled at all. So I had to go through them and sort through them and figure out what they were. And I initially planned to write a story about Mariam, but after getting the use of force videos in particular, I pitched this to CBS because I felt like it was something that people needed to see for themselves, that it wasn't something that I could adequately explain in words. So I'm going to show you the beginning of this.
There's just something so profoundly sad about this young woman.
I guess my first thought is, what is she doing here? Because she just didn't have that look to her.
We have mood disorder, bipolar disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. The prison was aware of her mental illnesses because they're the ones who classified her as seriously mentally ill.
I told you, well, you're depressed, and first you have to get in this cage, and then I'm going to bring the doctor in to talk to you. You'd say that's ridiculous.
The only treatment that you're getting is that mental health professional coming in and saying, are you wanting to kill yourself?
We had inmates that would cut themselves, swallow wires.
But do you feel qualified
to deal with mental health? No, not at all.
Prisoners have no consumer choice. There's really no incentive to please your customers.
This is Matt.
Why didn't somebody help my son? They just look at him like a number. They're not people to them.
I don't care who's at fault. You need to get it done because my clients are dying because you're not doing your jobs.
So at the time that I did this story, I periodically say that whatever the thing is like the most difficult thing that I've worked on, and this was definitely, at the time, I think one of, if not the most difficult story that I'd ever done. It was difficult for a few reasons. One, in terms of the reporting, Miriam wasn't there, you know, like Miriam was dead, and so there was no way for me to understand what her life had been like, you know, what happened to her. And as I said at the beginning of this, I want to show who people are, in part because I want whoever is reading or viewing or listening to my story to care about these people. You may not like them, but I want you to see who this person is, and I want you to be invested enough that you want to, this documentary is like 25 minutes, or, you know, I tend to write long articles, so I want you to stick with me from beginning to end, and I want you to understand who this person is. So part of the reporting was piecing together Miriam's life. It meant I used Facebook to find a post that someone had put up about Miriam and then deleted. And so I found the deleted post, and I contacted this woman, Peggy, who was a sort of prison abolitionist, and she corresponded with Miriam and had recorded phone conversations with her. So part of the documentary has these phone conversations with Miriam, where, you know, she talks about her hopes and dreams. Through Peggy, I met young women who were incarcerated in the jail with Miriam. I wrote them and spoke with one who had since been let out. The other is actually still incarcerated. And at the time that I wrote the second young woman, I did not know if I was going to hear from her because several months went by, and she eventually wrote me back, and the beginning of her letter said something along the lines of, you know, hello Lisa, she wasn't going to write me back. And she said, but I'm writing you now if for no other reason than I just have this need to be heard. And she sent this 17-page letter. And in that letter, she shared things like, this is what Miriam's favorite color was. This is what they talked about. They corresponded through the vents between their cells. And she thought of Miriam as a birthday present because Miriam had been brought to the prison, the jail, the day before her birthday. And so I got a lot of information from her. And through her, I found a woman who was incarcerated with Miriam, Wendy. And so I corresponded with Wendy. Now Wendy is serving a life without parole sentence. And she is very, so anything that comes in and out of prison, so whether it's a prison phone call, it's mail, these things are all monitored. And so some of the messages from Wendy was sort of like in code. And so when she wrote me, I didn't even really fully understand the first message that she sent, but we started corresponding, and she became a part of the documentary. And then I managed to track down Miriam's mother, and then I found an organization. Miriam's family was originally from Iraq, and there was an organization that was helping Iraqi refugees in Tucson, Arizona. And I found them, and they had a video that Miriam had made when I believe she was 8 years old about coming to the United States and not being able to speak English and what that was like. And so I put all of this together in this documentary to show kind of, you know, this is who this young woman was, this is what happened to her. But the documentary actually is about private prison healthcare companies, and as the name suggests, these are companies that are contracted by different states to provide healthcare, but that includes mental health care. And they are paid a certain amount per incarcerated person per day. And in order to make as much money as possible, they obviously don't want to spend the amount that they're being given by the state, so they they're not providing adequate resources, particularly for people with mental illnesses. And so what I found in doing this reporting was that in several states, this substandard care that they were providing, so essentially the care is you're locked in isolation, which is what happened to Miriam, and you're sometimes locked on continuous watch, where in your cell 24 hours a day, you're in a smock. Part of what the video shows is Miriam being taken to these isolation cells by force. They cut off your clothes, they put you in a smock, and you're in a cell where there's an officer in front of your cell watching you 24 hours. Now, if you're a young woman, you're in a smock that comes up to like here, and there's often a male officer watching you 24 hours a day. And that's sort of, and then you have a psychologist who might come by, say, do you want to kill yourself? You answer no, and that's sort of the psychological help that you're getting. So the documentary looks at that. It looks at these private prison healthcare companies. I, in addition to looking at Arizona, also went to Alabama, where there was a young man, Matthew, who had died by suicide, and I talked with his family. And so the piece looks at the fact that there are these 3 prison companies that they will go into a state, they will provide care, they will often get sued, or they just, there are issues with whatever they're doing. They move, the next company comes in, they're sued, they're not providing adequate care, they move, and then the next company comes in, and this is happening in several states throughout the country. I ended up, in addition to doing the documentary, writing a piece, and this is a piece that focused mainly on Miriam and included some of the stuff that I was not able to include in the doc. So I want to talk about my most recent work, and as I said, there have been different times in my career where I've said this is the most difficult thing. This is without a doubt the most difficult reporting that I've done. So in, I think it was like November 2021, I got an email from Joshua's mother, Amnesty, and that's her in the picture at the top of the page. And she wrote and she said that her son was incarcerated in the Texas Juvenile Justice Department, one of the facilities, and that he was harming himself. And it took me a while to get back to her. She then told me that he'd been locked up since he was 11, so he was incarcerated at 11. He kicked a school safety officer, and so was locked up. And what happens when I get, so I get a lot of these kinds of messages, sometimes from people who are incarcerated saying, hey, this thing is going on, can you write about it? And one of the things that I have to explain to people is that I'm not a lawyer. I can't change anything. The most that I can do is tell a story, and if something happens, then it happens, but 9 times out of 10, I'll tell a story and then nothing happens, and it's like, and the other thing is that if somebody writes me, that doesn't necessarily make it a story. So the fact that Joshua was locked up at 11, that he was harming himself in pretty severe ways, and at the time that his mother wrote me, he was 15 years old, and it was a horrible story. It wasn't necessarily a story that I could pitch that would be published. And so what I ended up doing was I talked with her. She sent me a whole bunch of records, specifically about Joshua. And then I went to the Texas Juvenile Justice Department, and I filed another public records request to get information on just how many people are harming themselves, and has that number gone up? And I looked at this over time and discovered that there had been an increase. So this first story that I wrote, I had initially planned to do this much longer investigative piece where I would talk to other young people to look at what was happening in these facilities. What happened in March 2022, Joshua was hospitalized 3 times for harming himself in pretty severe ways. And in journalism, you're not supposed to intervene, you're sort of supposed to be, I think there's a notion that you are somewhat distant from whatever you're reporting, and that's not how I operate. And I was afraid that Joshua was going to harm himself in a way where he would do permanent damage to himself, or worse yet, he wouldn't survive. And so I pitched this story then. It focuses very heavily on Joshua and Amnesty. I did talk with some other young people, and I did do other reporting, and and the sort of the context is that TJJD is understaffed, and you need to have a certain number of staff per kid to, in order for it to be legally what they're supposed to do. And because they were understaffed, they were locking kids in their cells. And so kids were hurting themselves often just to get out to use the bathroom. They were locked in their rooms and using like bags or other containers. And so a lot of it was they just wanted to get out. After I did this story, I actually talked to a former officer who said that sometimes kids were hurting themselves to the point where they were hospitalized because they got to leave the prison and they got to see the sky and trees and things that they didn't ordinarily see. So this was the first story that I did. This came out in August 2022. And about, I want to say 3 weeks after this was published, Joshua turned 16 and he was transferred from the juvenile system to the adult system. Now, the reason he'd been locked up so long for kicking a school safety officer is because what was happening is the staff, and I heard this from multiple kids and it's something that's been documented, the staff would pepper spray or kind of, grab kids and they would fight back. Now, every time you hit an officer, that's an assault on someone who's basically an officer of the law, and you get more time. And so you cannot send a 12-year-old or 11-year-old to an adult prison, but you can send a 16-year-old to an adult facility. So Joshua would have been out, like say Joshua had not done anything, he would have been out long before he even turned 15. But because of these assaults, when he turned 16, there were additional charges and he was sent to an adult prison. His mother was obviously very concerned about what would happen, and initially it seemed like he was doing a little bit better. In the adult system, he could communicate more freely with people, so when he was in the juvenile facility, I would have to speak with him via his mother. So he'd call his mother would call me, and we'd do a three-way call. When he was in the adult system, we communicated, there are like different electronic mail systems, and so he would write me. And he often would just write to say, hi, I'm doing well. One of the last messages that I got from him, he wrote that he was doing well, he was studying for his GED, and then he was like, but I hit an officer because he spilled coffee on me and he called me, whatever he called me, and I know I shouldn't do this, but I'm still doing well. And what I took from that message was that he was just a kid and he wanted to be seen as someone who's doing positive things. And a lot of the messages that I did get from him were about, look, I'm going to school, look, I did this, or I'm writing music, or I'm doing whatever the case might be. And even in him saying to me, because I wouldn't have known what he did, but I think he told me before he told his mother, because he figured one of us would tell the other. And he's like, look, before this gets out, I'm going to explain to you how this happened. I know I shouldn't have done it, but, So it appeared that he was doing okay. But then, actually, almost on March 24th last year, Joshua died by suicide. And, let's turn this off. And I wrote another story, and that was the last story that I did for the Pulitzer Center that was about his death. The reason that this was hard is because oftentimes, oftentimes I show up after the horrible thing has happened. I'm not usually there for the thing as it's playing out. And I have a relationship with Joshua's mother, Amnesty, that, she trusts me in a way that I don't think that she would trust a whole lot of other people. By the time she'd written me, she had written everybody that she could think of. She had written journalists in Texas, she had written people that were sort of like national places. She had written her local elected officials, she had written Ted Cruz, she had written, I think she even wrote Donald Trump's, she wrote just everybody that she could think of to say, look, this is happening to my son. and nobody responded. And what she tells me is that I was the only person that actually listened to her. And even when I didn't know that it was a story yet, I didn't know what was gonna happen with the reporting, I listened to her. Now, what that has meant is that I have to put boundaries in place, because often what I find is that people trust me. They're telling me these things, they're sharing these things in a way that they probably might share with a therapist. And so I think there's something that happens where she would send me texts. So she would have FaceTime videos with Joshua where she would take pictures of cuts on his arm or just ways that he had harmed himself. And she would text them to me. It was like no warning, I would get this image. And so I kind of had to, for myself, say, okay, I'm not, if a text comes in from, so I have my phone set up so that I actually can't see. I can see who the text is from, I can't see what it is. If something came from her, I wouldn't necessarily look at it immediately. I would wait until I was in a space where whatever it was, I could look at it. But it's been hard, because Joshua was somebody that I knew. Joshua was someone that I cared about. I care about his family. And it's something that, you know, really should not have happened. Now, as a result of the reporting that I did, a bill was passed towards the end of last year in Texas to raise the age at which a child can be incarcerated from age 11 to 13. And before the vote, the lawmaker who had put forward the bill read directly from the 2 stories that I wrote. And so, you know, as a journalist, I think people, you know, you want your work to have some sort of impact, and that's kind of how we're evaluated in terms of like, well, what impact has your work had? And so in that sense, you know, there are other things that have happened as a result of my reporting. So in that sense, there's been some impact, but it has been very hard because the impact has come as a result of a child's death. Like, I'm actually here talking to you because of work that I've done about Joshua. And so it's this thing that I feel like I'm always grappling with things as a journalist. I'm always thinking about why am I doing this work? What am I covering? Am I doing it for what I consider to be the right reasons? If my work ever becomes about I'm doing this because there are people who do work, and no, not knocking them, because like this will win an award, or this will get me to the next level of my career. And I don't ever want to see my journalism in that way, because I think the moment that I do is the moment that I need to stop. I think journalism is a public service. The work that I do is about getting people to see, and with incarceration in particular, unless you have personal experience, either you've been incarcerated or you know someone who's been incarcerated, you don't know what's going on in prisons. And it's by design. Even for me to get into a prison or for me to talk to someone, there are all of these barriers that are put up. And so the general public, you're not necessarily looking. And so that's sort of what I'm trying to do with this work, is to get people to see, like, this is your tax dollars are going towards whatever this is. It is not about sort of whether people are innocent or not. Most of the people that I know who are incarcerated, they did whatever the thing is that they're incarcerated for. And because they're serving these long sentences, what they did is often they killed at least one person. And so I sometimes have people ask me, like, how can you talk to someone who killed someone else? And it's a hard thing to explain, but I think that, again, in journalism, I don't get to sort of pick and choose. I can't write about just people who are doing nice things. I have to try to empathize and to see whoever it is that's in front of me, and to try to show that person not as I see them. So I try to kind of not see people through my lens. So whatever I think of them is kind of irrelevant, and I try to acknowledge what I might think and push it to the side. But I want people to be represented in a way where when I show them the final piece, they look at it, and even if they don't like that I included certain things, that they will say that that is an accurate representation and that I treated them fairly. So let me just stop there. And happy to take any questions that one might have. I know that was a lot. Yeah.
How do you, so you alluded to the have to kind of separate yourself, distance yourself. How do you, like, personally, like, do that? Because I feel like just with all of these cases, kind of, it can take a toll, right, on you as a human being. Like, how do you work through that, like, on a day-to-day or weekly basis?
It really, it depends on the situation. With Joshua and Amnesty, it's difficult because this is ongoing. So I mean, she texted me this morning, and I'm still in regular contact with her. I went for his birthday last August. They had a celebration at the cemetery that I went to. I am still reporting in a way, but I mean, it's sort of like it's a day by day thing, and it's sometimes Amnesty will text me and I cannot respond, and it's not that she's texted me anything, like I know next Monday, no wait, the 24th, yeah. It's gonna be a hard day for her, and I will check in with her, but it's something that's also going to be hard for me, because I remember getting the text from her. I actually was out of the country, I had my phone off, I turned it back on, and I saw she tried to call me several times, and there was a text that said, I need you, Josh is gone. And I got on the phone with her, and I was like, okay, please, this must mean something. Maybe this means something else. Like, I don't know what it means. I don't want it to mean what I think it means. And she, you know, she obviously told me what had happened, how he'd been found, and all these things. And I got off the phone, and then I just started sobbing. And that has been like an ongoing thing. Just there are moments where, even when the bill was passed, I actually didn't see it. Someone else sent it to me, and someone said to me, "That's amazing." I started crying, you know, because it's like, yes, but he's gone. So I don't have a good answer in terms of, it really is a day-to-day thing. I think these people, they stay with me. You know, like this stuff doesn't kind of just go away. I don't think about Mariam on a daily basis, but Mariam has informed what I have done going forward, and Joshua will inform what I do going forward. And it's just, I was telling the other class, therapy is a very good thing. That has been a very big help. And just figuring out ways to take care of myself, and figuring out when things are too much and where I just need to step away from my work.
At the earlier session, you talked about, I'm blanking on the name of the organization.
Oh, the DART Center. So the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma at Columbia University is an amazing resource. I had a fellowship from them, I want to say it was like maybe 2011, which is how I first heard about them. And this was when I was doing reporting in Haiti, and had not really thought about the impact that trauma has on journalists doing that work. Like, it felt very self-indulgent of me to say, oh, your traumatic story has traumatized me, because, you know, but that does happen. And I've had other fellowships and work with the DART Center now as a trainer. And so for those of you who are interested in that kind of work, that's a good resource. Yes.
You mentioned you were reporting on Haiti before you started doing juvenile incarceration. What is the reason for your switch to reporting on incarcerated juveniles?
So when I've told people this story, they're like, what's wrong with you? So I was reporting in Haiti. I did that for 4 years after the earthquake, and most of the reporting that I did was on sexual assault. So there was a lot of rape in the camps where people were living. And the last story that I did was about a lawyer in Haiti who was trying to prosecute people who'd been accused of rape. And what was happening was that people would be accused of rape. They may or may not have been arrested. If they were arrested, often the police would ask the woman questions like, well, what were you wearing? What did you do? You know, sort of like blaming the woman who'd been assaulted. And then they would, the men who committed these assaults would typically just go free. So he was trying to make sure that these people would be tried and then convicted and found guilty. And so he wanted to eliminate the issue of consent. And so what he was doing, he was looking at cases that just involved children, for people under the age of 18. And so I did these interviews, came back, And it wasn't just that one story, I think it was like the 4 years of all of this stuff that I hadn't really dealt with emotionally, even though I thought I had made it so that I couldn't work. Like I couldn't work on the story when I got back to New York, which is where I was living at the time. And so after I finished that story, I said, this is too traumatic, I don't want to do this anymore, I'm going to find something else to focus on. And then I found incarceration, which obviously is not a much easier subject. But I think with a lot of my work, there's a question about why are things happening. I cannot sort of pinpoint for you what it was about, like why I picked incarceration. I think it was just sort of, why does this country incarcerate more people than any other? Like that's kind of what my starting point was. And then I researched, and then as I did research, I found out, I started looking at juvenile sentencing, and then I found out about juvenile life without parole, and then I started wondering, like, what is it like to be 16 years old? And then that's it. And so the initial reporting that I did was both people who'd been recently sentenced, but I also talked to guys who'd been in since they were like 16, 17, I think one person was 15, who'd been in prison for like 40, 50, almost 60 years. And so they'd lived their whole lives in prison. And so that was the reporting that I looked at. But it was, again, it was sort of like I thought Haiti was too traumatic and incarceration would be somewhat easier. And it has not been. Yes?
What's your name? Wendy, you said she was close to Mary, right?
Yeah.
And she was doing life without parole. What did she do?
Wendy?
Yeah.
Wendy committed a murder of, and this is actually something that I found with a lot of women who've been incarcerated. She murdered a man who, actually both Wendy and the other young woman I mentioned who was in prison, murdered a man who she said had abused her. And the other young woman who was in prison, who I mentioned who sent the 17-page letter, was also in prison for murder. And this was somebody who had, basically it was like a trafficking situation. And you'll find that a lot of women who are incarcerated for these long sentences is because they have done something, but often it's to someone who has abused them in some way.
Does that make Damien that much sweeter? That it's a happier story?
Yeah,
Because it must be pretty rare.
he's out.
How's he doing? What's he doing?
Damien has kids now. Damien.
He's doing well.
Yeah, he's doing. I mean, he's doing well. Yeah, because again, he's someone who's out. He's stayed out. There are people I know who come out and then they've gone back, or they come out and it's really hard because we don't provide resources. We just sort of, okay, you're free. One of my classes when I was I taught at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. They did a class project, and I think it was called $25 in a bus ticket, because when people were released from New York State prisons, you get $25 and a ticket back to New York City, because you're assuming that's where you're from. And it's like you have to kind of figure out where are you going to live, where are you going to work, how are you going to make sure that you meet whatever the curfew is. And there are all of these things that, again, we don't necessarily provide resources for people who are formerly incarcerated so that they are able to live.
Does Damien still perform?
I don't know. I'm talking.
I hope so. He's really good.
Yeah, he was. I mean, I thought he was very talented. He was good.
You know, a lot of these people here are on the paper, and they probably have some questions about pursuing journalism as a career. Do you have anything to ask our pro here?
I was gonna say, kind of to add on to Kira's question, but how do you find like a field of interest to go into, and how do you stay positive and patient in pursuing it?
So I have the luxury as a freelancer to pick what interests me, and I will just say that I've been freelancing for most of my career, but I started journalism when the industry was very different. I tell my students, when you graduate, find a job so you can have steady income and health insurance. Freelancing is great for me because I teach, so I have steady income and health insurance. And so I have the luxury of saying, I'm really interested in whatever this thing is. I research as much as I can about, so when I started doing work on incarceration, I read books, I did clip searches, I talked to experts. And then once I feel like I have enough knowledge of whatever it is, and this is not to say that I'm not constantly still learning, I then look for stories, and the ideas come from, again, the juvenile life without parole story was something that I just like, what is happening here? How are we locking people up? And staying positive, as horrible as these stories are, I love being a journalist and can't imagine doing anything else. Like I have friends who are like accountants, and I'm like, I don't go, you know, if there are any accountants in here, I'm sorry. But it's like, it's not something, you know. I get to talk to people I would never ordinarily cross paths with, and so that kind of is what keeps me going.
To follow up on that, how do you find the people and kind of research their stories?
So I find people, it really depends on the story. I will find people with incarcerated related things, either sometimes through lawyers. I'm in different Facebook groups for people who are formerly incarcerated or families of people who are incarcerated. I ask before I go into these groups. I explain I'm a journalist and I kind of just sit in there, and if I see something I might contact someone. If I have a topic, so with juvenile life without parole, I just did clip searches for anyone who'd been sentenced to life without parole. And again, I wanted to look at after 2012. So I just looked for as many clips as I could. And then I wrote those people in prison to say, this is what I'm doing, can I talk with you? And then the way that I select the people for my story, because with each story that I do, for every one person that's in the story, I probably talk to 5 other people. And I'm looking for someone who, one, they can tell their story, like they are comfortable answering questions, they are comfortable thinking about things, they're comfortable sharing things that might be uncomfortable. And then their story illustrates whatever it is that I'm trying to tell a story about, if that makes sense. Yeah?
Do you ever have moments where you feel disillusioned to how much a difference journalism can make and what gives you faith in it?
Yeah. So I think in doing this work, I've just always said to myself, nothing may come of this. And I tell people that, and I know that, and I know that I'm not doing it because it's going to change a law or someone's going to get out of prison, or, I mean, sometimes people are moved to do things as a result of my work, like on an individual level. But I'm not doing it, I'm not attached to the outcome, because if I'm attached to the outcome, I will be disappointed over and over and over again. So I see it more as I'm showing something, I'm showing a situation, and then whatever happens, like whatever people do with that is sort of beyond my power. So yeah, I don't look at it as I'm creating change, I look at it as I'm just showing sort of like what's happening behind prison walls.
Do you have, from like personal experience, any advice when it comes to supporting people who are recently incarcerated?
I think it depends on the need, because I think there are different levels of need. So there's like the basic kind of, I need food, shelter, job, like sort of those basic needs. There are mental health needs. I think there's, depending on how long someone's been incarcerated, they may not have family. They may have lost contact with people who are in their family might have died. So I guess just having personal support, having someone that they can talk to. But I think the mental health support, or having someone that they feel that they can share things with, is really important. There's somebody who spent, his name is Zarius, and he spent 47 years in prison on a juvenile life without parole sentence, and he went in when he was 17. Now, he was still in contact with his family, and the story that I wrote was basically about the fact that in 2016, the Supreme Court allowed for him to be resentenced and he was released. And when I started talking to him, I started talking with him in 2015, and this was before he knew that he was going to be getting out of prison, so he thought he was going to die there. And I asked him several times, you went in at 17, you're really young, what was this experience like? Were there any things that were challenging? And the whole time, he was like, no, there wasn't anything particularly bad. So then he comes out, his large family, he has a place to live, they have this big dinner. When he gets there, he reconnects with his mother, who again has not seen him for 47 years. And a week goes by, and he calls me, and he says, the way that he likened it was to coming back from war. And he said, when you asked me about the things that happened to me, I was in prison. And so I didn't want to think about these things. I didn't want to process it because I'm in the situation and I can't escape it. So I'm just going to block it out. Now that I'm home, all of these things are coming to my mind. I can't talk with my family about these things because he didn't want to burden them. He also didn't feel like they would understand. And so he started talking to me about them because I'd been asking him all of these questions and he felt that he could share. So I think, it's there, and in New York, there are different organizations that provide different levels of support. But I think it's also just like talking to the person and understanding, one, what they say they need, but then also maybe anticipating things that they may not know that they need and just saying, here are some resources. Yeah.
I have a two-part question. It's the first part is how does your identity inform your reporting, and how do you find that it's received among your colleagues in the media field, as well as among the people that you actually write about?
That's a very good question, and you are a very good journalist. And I will say, and I will explain why. So one of the things that I think we need to be aware of as journalists is that we're people. And how I see the world has been shaped by where I grew up, what my family's like, what I value, what access I had to certain resources. And so if there are places where I feel like I've enjoyed a certain amount of privilege, so I have 2 master's degrees, I am well educated, I've had access to education that a lot of people haven't had. English is my first language. I was born in this country. So those places where I have privilege, I look at as being the places where there are potential pitfalls, where somebody who has not had the same experience, I may see them and either not understand something, misjudge something, and those are the places where I feel like for myself, I have to be very careful. So I think thinking about one's identity as a journalist is really important. It's not something that we think about or talk about. We kind of think of, we're neutral, we're objective, we're not. We all have biases, we all see the world in a particular way, and to pretend that that doesn't exist, I feel you end up with coverage that is problematic, and that leads to us seeing certain communities in a particular way. I think that as a Black woman covering incarceration, there are not many people. There are not many other Black. I can't think of any. I teach at San Quentin Prison. I teach their journalism. They have a journalism guild and they have a newspaper, and they had their graduation last Friday. And one of the guys said to me, he's like, to have a lot of the volunteers who come in here are white. To have a Black woman come in here is rare, and it means something. So I'm thinking of a couple of things. It's one, how do I see the world? 2, how do people perceive me? So do they trust me because they see something in common, and do they not trust me because they think of me as being different? The documentary that I did where we went to Alabama and we talked with the family of this young man who died by suicide, when people talk to me on the phone and they hear my name is Lisa Armstrong, they often assume I'm white. Now I know they assume I'm white because sometimes they say things to me where I'm like, probably shouldn't have said that to me, and no, I'm not white. And so I often, in my own mind, because it's not necessarily reality, think I'm going to show up and this person's going to be surprised. And I have to get this person who's surprised by me to still trust me and still tell my story. And that was something where Yasu is Japanese. So Yasu's the producer from CBS. And as we drove to this family's house, we were joking, we're going to show up, black woman, Japanese man. They're going to be like, what is this? But we were creating that narrative ourselves. Like, they didn't say anything. So again, to show you that we made these assumptions, we ended up spending 3 hours with the family. They, you know, shared and talked and did all these things. That is a very long-winded way of saying that I think about my identity a lot. I think about how to bridge gaps if I sense that there is a difference. I try to be aware of when I'm creating a narrative that may not necessarily be the case. And I try to really listen to people. And I might go into a situation thinking that I'm going to tell this story. Like, I try to come up with stories not based of sort of this has come out of my head, but from actually talking to people and figuring out what the story is. But I'm human. And I want to make sure that I'm not telling a story that I, as the person, I don't have lived experience. I think this is the story. I try to listen to the people who do have the lived experience and will tell me, no, this is actually what this story is. Did you ask both parts of the story? The question?
You answered.
I answered.
Like, so
Great,
much.
thank you. Yes.
For some of the people that you have, people that may have like committed violent crimes and possibly fit like the description of someone you think of when you think of like a prisoner or a criminal.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that for the long time that they've been in prison, some of them have like changed? Do you see that in someone?
Yeah, I think any story that I've done, people have changed. And a lot of times I'm dealing with people who did things when they were very young. If you think about being 15, 16, I don't know how old you all are now, but you change. Just whether you plan to or not, you change. I will say that most of the people I know who are incarcerated are some of the most introspective people that I know. Because what a lot of them have explained is that if you hit what is basically for you rock bottom, and there are many different levels of rock bottom. For some people, being in prison, that's not rock bottom. Because a lot of people I know are like, I was living this lifestyle, I knew I'd either end up in prison or dead. I'm not dead, so this isn't rock bottom. Rock bottom is often, I'm being held in isolation, I don't have anything other than myself. So what I've heard from people is even though isolation has been shown to have a severely negative impact on one's mental health. For a lot of the folks, they've said, I was in here, it was just me, and I had to face myself because I had no books, nothing, no other distraction, and I had to kind of figure out, how did I end up here? And then it's like looking at their lives and learning how to control emotions in a way that they were not necessarily taught. One of the guys at San Quentin was actually saying that they need to teach emotional, I think he said it was like the wave frames, like you need to teach emotional intelligence at school. Like you need to teach people how to manage and express emotions because we don't do that. And he said he's in for murder, he said and he was locked up as a teenager, if someone had told me that as a boy, it's okay for me to express sadness or I can show something other than anger, I probably wouldn't be in here. So yes, most of the people I know have changed. They have changed to varying degrees. There are people who have changed to the point where I'm like, I don't know what value there is in having them incarcerated. I think there's a problem with incarceration as a system as a whole. And then there's some people who have changed where I'm like, I can still see, like there are people who will not tell me 100% of the truth. And I know they're not telling me 100% of the truth because I've done other reporting to sort of, I have to fact check the things that people tell me. And some of those people I'll say, well, you know, you told me this, but this is what my reporting shows. And they're like, yep, I lied to you. Here's why. But they've all changed.
You've been terrific. Any other last questions for Professor Armstrong? No? Well, I want to thank you for your time, but I also want to hear from Jesus for a minute. So let's give Professor Armstrong a applause. Thank you so much. Where can they find you? Where can people find you?